Well, during the break time at the Southern California Reformed Baptist Pastors Conference, we had the opportunity to spend a little bit of time with Sam Renihan. Sam is the contributor to a number of books, and I'm not sure, Sam, if I can call you the author of any of them. I believe maybe the primer?
Yes.
And I've heard primer. What do you prefer?
Primer is the proper pronunciation.
Very good. You're always so helpful, and I need that. God Without Passions, followed by God Without Passions, a reader, right? And reader is the correct pronunciation? Yeah.
Yes.
Okay, good. Extra helpful. That's edited by Sam Renihan with the foreword by Carl Truman. And this one you contributed to, Confessing the Impassible God.
A very small portion, yes.
Very small portion. So here we have a couple of books on impassibility. Why a couple of books? And as you answer that question, maybe you can move into something that I've heard you say before, which is that emotions are an aspect of impassibility, but not the whole, and yet it's a good starting point to then branch out to the whole.
Well, the reason I started with The Reader, because that was the first book that I put together, was that people around me and people that I didn't know, like on the internet and things like that, were saying that we're not really sure what it means when the confession says that God is without passions. What does that phrase mean, without passions? And you know, I felt a pretty good idea of what that meant theologically, but if someone had said to me, could you prove that to me? Like, could you show me that that's what it says? I could have made an argument from the confession and from the scriptures, which is wonderful, but I wanted to really know for certain, okay, what did all the people behind these confessions believe and say about these things? So I started doing research in 17th and 16th century literature, looking at commentaries, looking at systematic theologies, looking at pastoral theology works, and I began to find very quickly what they said about God being without passions, and they would define what passions mean, and then they would talk about passions in the context of human nature or in the context of the divine nature, and so why God cannot have passions. So anyway, I put the Reader together to say, wow, I'm finding all this data that most people don't even have access to, just because they're on libraries, who knows where, and I just see them on PDF files. So I want to put those all in one place for everyone so they can read it too and see for themselves. There's actually no mystery about it. They spoke about these things clearly. They spoke about them often in different genres of writing. And then they put it in their confession so that when you look at the confession, you say, oh, this is just a summary of all these other things that they said, and it makes a lot more sense. So that's why I put the Reader together. And then I just put a short introduction in front to kind of help people think it through, because it's a lot of material to just kind of get hit with 60 authors. But here's the benefit of the Reader. Okay, so you're confronted with a lot of writers you've never heard of saying things that maybe you've never thought about. You read the first one, you think, well, that's heavy. You read the second one, and you say, oh, that's kind of similar to what the first guy said. By the time you get to the 60th author, that repetition has been a teaching tool to show you, okay, now I understand better what the earlier writers were saying. And by the end, the method has been repeated so many times, as well as the conclusions, that it teaches you. And so it's not just a dump of information, it's also a way of learning by repetition. So that was the Reader, and I found that very helpful for myself, and I can say that because I didn't write those things, I just put them together in the book. But people still find that a little bit inaccessible because I did not update the language, and it's still thick content. So what I wanted to do was to teach our church these things and kind of reduce down the content of the Reader and explain it more in simpler detail. And that I did in 4 Sunday school lessons and 2 sermons, which were then put into the book form, which is the primer. So the Reader was my attempt to get all the information out there for everyone to enjoy and have, whether they agree or disagree with it. And then the primer was my attempt to help everyone to understand this data in a simpler and more understandable way.
Now, with the emotions and being a starting point, God's without body, parts, or passions, the Second London Baptist Confession, and there has been there's been much made about that, whether it be confusion or conviction or controversy. God not being passionate, or in some cases looked at as emotionless.
Mm-hmm.
But I've heard you use terms that we have affections, but in God they're perfections. So starting with emotions, how is that important from a pastoral sense to explain passibility in one aspect and then expand it to the whole?
That's a good question. So if we think about impassibility in the big picture, a passion would be a new state of being, or being brought into some new existence, we could say. So right now I'm calm, but if I become angry, that would be a passion where I have just entered a new state of being. I am now angry, or I am now loving, or I am now merciful. I can enter into these states of being. And so a passion in general is just entering into a new state of being. A passion more specifically defined, as the old authors would say, would be emotion, which is a change, emotion of the soul worked out through the body relative to good or evil. Now let me explain what that means. So emotion of the soul means my mind and my will. I perceive an object, and I interpret it as good or evil. And then I respond and react to it. I either go towards it or away from it. So I either love it, that's being drawn towards it, or I hate it, I'm drawn away from it or pushed away from it. I am merciful towards it, or perhaps I have apathy towards it. And you can give all sorts of, I'm happy or I'm sad. So I perceive objects, emotion of the soul, where my mind perceives and then my will takes action with my actual self, my body. Emotion of the soul worked out through the body relative to perceived good or evil. And so what has happened? I've encountered something, and based on what I've encountered, I've just entered a new state of being. Happiness, sadness, love, hatred, anger, mercy, all these things. So those are passions. Sometimes they're also called affections. And so in God, we have to say, well, is God's love something that's brought about by another object, or is His mercy something that's caused by Him encountering and perceiving another object, interpreting it as good or evil, and then reacting to it? And we'd say, well, no, that can't be. And so the next question is, well, then does God not have love and not have mercy and not have all these things? And we would say, well, no, that's not the case, because in God, as you mentioned, they're not passions or affections, but rather perfections. And so from the fullness of His being, of His simple essence, He loves. He does good to His creatures, and He is merciful. He helps those who cannot help themselves or who have nothing to offer back to Him. He is just in and of Himself, not because He finds something, He is loving, in and of Himself, not because He finds something lovely in the creature that He interprets and responds to, but because God is love, as the Scriptures tell us. And so we have to think of impassibility in that big sense of no new states of being, in that more restricted sense of what we usually call emotions, motions of the mind and the body relative to objects, and then say, God doesn't have those things, and He can't have those things based on who He is and what He is as God, the simple, perfect essence, and based on what the Scriptures tell us. He's not a man. God is love, and he can't be provoked in all those ways.
So when someone looks at the doctrine of impassibility and God without passions, and they conclude, well, God doesn't care, that's a wrong conclusion.
Yeah, because they would be thinking that because God doesn't have my emotions, that therefore He can have no emotions. And granted, we're saying that really God doesn't have emotions, because in Him they're perfections, you know? So we just have to realize that our language is creaturely, and we're describing a perfect creator.
So there's a perfect love that will not change.
Right.
And that's a great message. That's the ultimate message.
Right, because as we scrub our language and ourselves clean of the passion in love, it becomes the perfection of love. And so we're not losing anything, we're gaining everything with impassibility. It doesn't make God less wonderful to me, it makes Him all the more wonderful to me.
And so when someone looks at it initially and thinks, does God care? And then they move and change to understanding it correctly, they know God better, don't they?
They do. I mean, if you're in a relationship with someone, the more you know them, the more you can trust them or not trust them. And in our case, the more we know God, we clearly trust Him all the more.
Very good. Changing it up a bit, your doctoral studies, maybe you can tell us a little bit about how those are going, what the focus is.
I am a PhD candidate at the Free University of Amsterdam. That's a school that Abraham Kuyper founded. And I'm doing a dissertation on the federal theology of the particular Baptists in the 17th century. So the dates that I'm looking at are 1642 to 1702, like a 60-year period within which the First and Second London Baptist Confessions were published, and looking at the writers or authors associated with those confessions and the churches that they were in to say what was their federal theology and how does it compare and contrast to their Paedo-Baptist brethren and context, the Independents and the Presbyterians, and things like that. So it's a work in historical theology, just trying to cover as many sources as possible to give a very complete view over time of how their covenant theology developed and diversified, because it wasn't all just exactly the same thing throughout their history. There was diversity as well as unity in the particular Baptist camp. And so comparing within themselves as well as comparing them to their larger context.
Now, how does understanding covenant theology rightly help you work the Scriptures properly and therefore understand God rightly?
Well, we could probably think of a lot of applications to answer that question. A few would be understanding covenant theology better gives me a better understanding of what God has promised to me in the covenant of grace, or the new covenant. You know, who is the God with whom I am in covenant? And what do I owe to him? What are my obligations? Or how do we understand the church? Well, we understand the church in light of who God has made his covenant people through his Son, Jesus Christ. So whether it's personal issues of salvation or practical issues of ecclesiology, understanding the covenant better manifests itself visibly and demonstrably in our lives and in the life of the church.
Now, with the Second London Baptist Confession, that specifically, how does that help historically get a view as to covenant theology, particularly for Reformed Baptists?
Here's what I want to argue in my dissertation. What unified Paedo-Baptist covenant theology and what diversified Paedo-Baptist covenant theology is the same thing that unified particular Baptist covenant theology and diversified particular Baptist covenant theology. So what I mean by that is, what will you find in all Reformed Paedo-Baptist covenant theologians? You'll find a dogmatic argument about the law and the gospel, that the law condemns, the law commands and condemns if you do not keep it, and the gospel promises salvation. And so that really develops into the covenants of works and grace. And if you're denying those matters of salvation, you're clearly not Orthodox, not Reformed. And so there's unity there. But where's their diversity? There's diversity among Paedo-Baptist federal theologians in the way that they explain, not dogmatically, but historically, the progression of the covenants through history, or in particular, the progression of the covenant of grace through history. Okay, so within Paedo-Baptist covenant theology, you have this unity and diversity. In the particular Baptist covenant theology, what does the confession, the particular Baptist confession, Second London, confess in chapter 7? It talks about the continuity of salvation throughout all of history. It's a dogmatic argument. Okay, salvation has been one and the same by faith alone in Jesus Christ alone for all of history, which means they're just as united with the Paedo-Baptist brethren that they have as the Paedo-Baptist brethren are amongst themselves. They're just as reformed on that point. And how do they differ? Well, they differ in their opinions on the historical outworking of the covenant of grace, just as the Paedo-Baptists disagreed amongst themselves on that. And so what that does, and what our confession does in chapter 7, is it puts them in their historical context. It shows how they were similar and how they were different. They were the same in terms of salvation. They were different in terms of the moving of the historical economies, or the progression of the historical economies, which is very natural and normal in their context. And we should appreciate that and realize we're not some new creature that sprung from nothing, but rather they were a development within a larger context of covenantal thinking.
Well, we certainly are looking forward to the fruits of your work with particular Baptist covenant theology. We'll be edified by it. We already have been by your contributions to impassibility with the books that are out, and we're certainly looking forward to learning more as we ride on your coattails, your studies. You've been learning a lot, and we're grateful that you're sharing that with us. Thanks, Sam.
Well, thank you for the encouragement. Praise be to God.
Yes, amen.